The Bowl of Heaven, written by Evangeline Adams. Copyright 1926 by the Dodd, Mead and Company. First edition. The contents: an introduction by Lynn Wells. The first chapter, My Job and How I Do It. Second chapter, A Grim Success. Third chapter, A Tale of Two Cities. Fourth chapter, Dabbling in Heathenism. Fifth chapter, A Horrible Example. Sixth chapter, We Are All Children of the Stars. Seventh chapter, Life and Death. Eighth chapter, The Moneymakers. Ninth chapter, Some Ladies of Venus. Chapter 10, I Never Gamble. Chapter 11, A World in Love. Chapter 12, Astrological Marriages, My Own and Others. Chapter 13, The New Natology. Chapter 14, Twins and Things. Chapter 15, Why Most People Come to Me. Chapter 16, Am I Always Right? And the final chapter 17, As I See Life. Introduction by Lynn Wells. In The Bowl of Heaven, Evangeline Adams wrote of her long and highly successful career as an astrologer. She described the people who were her clients, many of them nationally or world famous, discussing their problems, the astrological advice she gave them, and the results of her advice. Practicing for some 40 years, first in Boston, and from 1899 in New York until her death in 1932, Miss Adams guided and advised over 100,000 people through their troubles and the confusions and complexities of life. She based her advice on the astrological chart, which contains an intricate pattern of information applicable only to the individual for whom it's drawn. To say that a person is a Leo or a Capricorn may be true in itself, but this is only the sign in which the sun is placed at his birth. It is an astrological important point, but only one among a great many others of equal or often of much greater importance. The astrological chart is highly complex, and her ability to analyze a chart with all of its intricate detail and to interpret this in understandable terms made Evangeline Adams a great astrologer. Astrology is a subject for rational analysis, and I cannot too strongly emphasize that in guiding her clients, Miss Adams was not a mystic. In her own words, I do not claim to be psychic or clairvoyant. I do not read minds or faces or handwriting or palms. A member of the old New England Adams family, she was a practical, logical person with an analytical mind. The guidance she gave to her clients was all drawn from the study of astrological chart itself. Miss Adams wrote several books which distill her long years of astrologic experience. Astrology, Your Place in the Sun. Astrology, Your Place Among the Stars. Astrology for Everyone, and The Bowl of Heaven. The first two give a clear and comprehensive description of the sun, moon, and each of the planets in each of the 12 zodiacal signs, and the effects of the various positions upon man. They should be owned by everyone interested in astrology. Your Place Among the Stars is particularly valuable for its explanation of the human temperament. It could be well read by every professional person, lawyer, doctor, sociologist, or anyone else who deals with people, as it describes the subtle inner forces which impel people to act the way they do. In fact, everyone can read this book and profit. Tables give the dates when various planets are in various signs, checked with birth date of the significant paragraphs, can do much to help man to understand himself and his inner complexities. The Bowl of Heaven is a different type of book. Here Evangeline Adams wrote mainly of her actual practice. In a series of case histories, she shows how a working astrologer talks to and advises people with real and often very serious problems. I can corroborate much of the contents of this book. as I was trained by Miss Adams and worked with her for many years. I can almost say that I knew her before I was born. Following the Windsor Hotel fire in New York in 1899, Miss Adams moved into a studio in Carnegie Hall, living and working there until her death. My father became managing director of the hall soon after the turn of the century, and my parents moved into the Rembrandt Studios, the next door building. My mother and Miss Adams became friends, and I still have the chart she drew for me when I was a baby. As soon as I was old enough, I entered her studio working and studying there until I married. I then opened my own studio, and by this time Evangeline Adams' name had become so widely known that she wasn't able to see everyone who desired an interview, and she referred hundreds of people to me. When she died, I lost not only a valued friend, but also a guide and a counselor. As the Bull of Heaven is not a study of the principles of astrology, a brief discussion of them may help to explain the importance of Miss Adams' work. First, astrology is the oldest consistently studied subject known, having been studied all over the world for thousands of years, as is shown by the great zodiac of Denedra from the ancient temple of Hathor in Egypt, and the ancient Hindu, Arabian, and Chinese zodiacs. This most comprehensive and explanatory philosophy defines the basic structure of reality and man's relationship to the world about him, describes the growth and movements of nations, the changing influences of nature which affect man for better or worse, the intricacies of the individual man's temperament and character, and the pattern of his physical body with its strengths and weaknesses. To work with such a vast subject and to use it as a basis for aiding and guiding people needs not only a keen mind, but also good judgment and common sense, backed with tolerance, sympathy, and understanding. The basic philosophy of astrology is that man is not separate from nature, but is an inherent part of it. As the forces of nature change, they change man's character and his worldly interests and activities. The zodiacal signs, planets, and aspects are not the source of the influence which affect man, but the indicators of the state of the nature at any moment. By studying the sign and planetary positions, it is possible to note the quality of nature's forces at a time and place of the birth of the individual, which will determine his character and his life. The horoscope chart is a planetary map. The zodiacal circle is divided into 12 areas called signs, with its particular symbol and quality, from Aries, cardinal fire, to Pisces, mutable water. The spherical Earth is divided into 12 houses. The relative positions of these two circles are plotted, and in the circles are placed the positions of the Sun, Moon, and the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Little is yet known of the effects of the recently discovered Pluto, which so far appears only to affect nations, not individuals. A study of this chart shows the forces which make man what he is and what he will be in his life to come. The chart drawn for one person isn't like the chart of any other person. In fact, I estimate that some 25 million different charts could be drawn from the same moment of time, the difference being the place of birth. A baby born in New York will have a perceptibly different chart from one born in New Jersey. Each horoscope is a blueprint of the character and temperament, personal and worldly and business potentials, and the physical body of an individual. That's why the chart, when analyzed by a competent astrologer, can guide him away from the weaker and adverse qualities which exist in one form or another in everyone and toward the more constructive elements of his life. This can be helpful for an adult facing a serious problem or an opportunity, as well as for a young person who could be warned against a potentially unhappy marriage or guided toward a suitable occupation. The various sign, house, and planetary positions and the aspects of the chart form a highly complex pattern. Miss Adams' logical, practical mind came to the fore in synthesizing these complexities, analyzing the potentials indicated, and drawing from them a constructive answer directly helpful to the person concerned. For example, if a client comes with a question, "Shall I open a hardware supply business?" It's no use telling them that his Jupiter is in Sagittarius in the 3rd house, with the Sun, Mars, and Mercury in dynamic signs, this means nothing to the client. The information must be interpreted in his terms that he is too restless and imaginative to be fixed in a fixed occupation, and that even if he attempts it, his own desires and events will cause him to change his work before long. The natal chart indicates what may be termed life patterns, the trends which will be dominated throughout the individual's life. In addition, there's also the trend of approaching influences which may be repressive, neutral, or expansive in one or another place in life, various transitory influences being in effect for a few days to a few years. These influences superimpose themselves upon the natal forces and temporarily affect them for better or worse. Astrology is such a vast subject that much remains to be learned about it, particularly in the forecasting period to come. In The Bowl of Heaven, Evangeline Adams gives an account of her discovery of the accidental ascendant and its importance in guiding clients. The person asks, how will things be for me in the next month or next year? May not be interested in this technical information except as it helps to supply a better answer. The student of astrology should pay special attention to the accidental ascendant, however, as it's one of the very few and original creative discoveries in astrological knowledge in recent centuries, and of great value to the working astrologer. Evangeline Adams also made another important contribution to the practice of astrology. New York State had an archaic law against acrobatics performers, circus riders, men who desert their wives, and people who pretend to tell fortunes. To tell fortunes is a meaningless phrase both in language and in law, and when a suit was brought against her in 1912, it was thrown out of court, the judge stating that it was obvious that she had not broken the law. She was determined to do what she could to legalize astrology once and for all. And so when an anonymous client brought another suit against her in 1914, she retained the best counsel available, Clark L. Jordan. She insisted on having the case tried and as a test offered to analyze in the courtroom the chart of a person entirely unknown to her. Judge Fresky gave her only a birth date with a time and place of birth, and as a result of her analysis, he gave a long and highly favorable decision, the essence being the defendant raises astrology to the dignity of an exact science. She violated no law. The unknown person was a judge's son, and he later admitted that Evangeline Adams' analysis gave him a new insight into his son's character. This was an impressive demonstration of astrology and has freed astrologers, at least in New York State, of the charge of being people who pretend to tell fortunes. The astrologer certainly does not attempt to predict the future to the extent the Weather Bureau does not, or a stock market service. The astrologer does not say will happen, except in simpler cases. From the chart, he can see the trend of influences approaching in various phases of a person's life, such as in love, family affairs, health, or business. By describing the type and timing of these influences, he can warn the person against approaching risks and advise him of favorable trends. A man is still free to follow a path which his chart indicates to be a dangerous one. This opens the great question which has puzzled philosophers for centuries, the question of free will. As an experienced astrologer, my opinion is that no one has complete freedom of action. Man is partly committed, partly conditioned by his own nature, by life, and by circumstances. No one in the world is free to do anything or everything he wants. If there were complete freedom of will and action, everyone would be healthy and wealthy. The chart indicates a certain way of life. It is only by finding and following it that man can fulfill himself. Within his own field, he can have a successful and creative life, and he can waste his potentials and complain because others have more money or fame than he. It is up to him. Many people have said to me, if you know so much, why don't you make a fortune in the stock market? It is because my chart indicates that I cannot be Be a successful speculator. I know I would lose in the end, so I don't try. The relativity of free will shows itself in the question of health. Man is born with a definite physique and energy pattern, each chart indicating a susceptibility to certain disorders and illnesses. Note the word susceptibility. Good health largely depends on what you do and how you live. Even if you do not know your own chart, study your susceptibilities and follow a pattern of living that minimizes excessive strain upon any weak part. You'll feel better, you'll live longer. In the same way, be consciously aware of and control personal weaknesses such as bad temper, drinking too much, gambling, or being accident prone. Self-awareness and self-control can save you a lot of trouble and the consequences of wrong actions. Remember the ancient saying, know thyself. Astrology is a complex Astrology is a complex philosophy, and its various facets have entered into ordinary life in many ways. The scales, the symbol of justice in the courtroom, is the zodiacal sign Libra, the balance. The 12 jurors should theoretically represent the 12 principles of life as indicated by the 12 signs: mercy, revenge, hatred, fear, and others. The 12 revolving around the poles of Aries, of dynamic action, and Libra, peace and justice. Unfortunately, man's nature is such that these idealistic principles are rarely fulfilled. The prescription, the RX on a doctor's prescription, is the symbol of the planet Jupiter. Every prescription thus invokes Jupiter's beneficent aid for the patient. The four evangelists symbolize the four fixed signs. In church sculpture, the four figures are almost always accompanied by their appropriate symbol, and often symbols are used within the figures. You may also read the Vision of Ezekiel for its astrological references. Astrological symbols have been widely used in architecture, both government and private. They may be seen in government buildings in Washington, in the courthouse in New York City, on Paul Manship's fine statue of Prometheus in Rockefeller Plaza, and in different other places here and abroad. Astrology has often been attacked by astronomers who say it's wrong, showing the Earth as center of the solar system. Actually, the chart is drawn on the basis of a spherical Earth, rotating to the east with the sun as the center, showing that ancient astrologers knew these astronomical principles many thousands of years ago. On a relativity basis, the Earth is the center for us. From the galactic point of view, it's the astronomers who are wrong. The moon not revolving around the Earth, nor the Earth around the sun, but all three planets following a weaving serpentine course around the galactic center. And as the galaxy itself is moving, it depends upon your position and point of view in what direction the sun and planets are moving. Astrological questions also involve other issues. Many people have heard of the death of the president in office elected in the year ending 0. It's happened each time since 1840. It may be noted that only 4 Aquarians have ever been elected to presidency, and all 4 have died in office: Harrison, Lincoln, McKinley, and Roosevelt. Each death has been signaled by a powerful aspect of Uranus in the heavens to Uranus in the natal chart of the United States, drawn for the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Uranus is a critical planet for the United States, standing right on the ascendant of the natal chart. The 3 conjunctions have marked the 3 most critical periods in American history: the Revolution, the Civil War, and Second World War, each time the very existence of the country being at stake. For those interested in the next aspect, though not a conjunction, occurs during the term office of the president elected in 1980. An even larger question involves precession of the equinoxes. It's taking some 2,000 years to move through one sign. Astrologers have for centuries been looking to the Aquarian age, and it is generally considered to be that this scientific age of the world is slowly entering. There are many who look forward to a new golden age, and there's no doubt that science has created many remarkable advances in bettered human living. But will these change human nature sufficiently to stop crime and war? Viewing the world as it is today and taking into account the exceptionally powerful world aspects coming into effect. In not too many years in the future, the outlook appears to be rather bleak. It may be because of this that so many people feel an inward sense of fear and insecurity. The restlessness, recklessness, and drug taking of young people are manifestations of this fear. Evangeline Adams had a wide knowledge of both human nature and world affairs. In 1910, she predicted the defeat of the highly popular Theodore Roosevelt in the 1912 presidential election. In 1912, she warned of the onset of the First World War. She also forecast the election of Calvin Coolidge and many other important events. She was the most recent of a long line of famous astrologers of the past who warned and guided, including Nostradamus, Tycho Brahe, the scientist Newton, Lilly, who foretold the Great Plague and the Fire of London in 1666, through Raphael, Alan Leo, and many others, from the time of Chaldea to the present day. There is an ancient saying, character is destiny. Man's nature determines the life he lives. Man can improve himself, can raise himself to a higher level of thought and action, if he wishes to do so. By raising himself, he will raise his living conditions above poverty, crime, and war. If there is anyone seeking a working philosophy of life, a philosophy uncluttered with metaphysical complexities and applicable to the business of daily living, I can do no better than to recommend Evangeline Adams' last chapter in this book, I See Life. Author Lynn Wells. Chapter 1. My job and how I do it. My working day begins as a businessman's does, with the never-ending task of answering letters. The interest in astrology is unbelievably great. A brief article about my work recently appeared in a popular magazine. There was no mention of my name and no thought on the part of the editor or writer that there would be any response from the public. The author of the article was in Northwest in Seattle, I think, when he received a telegram from the publisher in New York saying that they had forwarded to him 150 letters the morning after publication, 250 the same afternoon, and that they were holding several hundred which had come on the morning of the second day. What should he do with them? He wired back that he couldn't possibly answer so many letters, and that they should send them to Miss Adams. They did. By the hundreds, by the thousands, 11,700 people had written to the author of the article asking for the name and address of the astrologer mentioned in the story. I tell these facts to indicate the size of the public with which I deal. My own files for 30 years back are even more impressive, evidence of the almost universal interest in astrology. My correspondence, therefore, is enormous, and this is the first of my daily cares. The demand of my personal interviews is equally important. I seldom sit down to dine in my own home after a heavy day in the studio without the sound of the telephone echoing through the dining room. I promise myself every night that I will not answer it again, and sometimes I'm really too tired to hear it. But on such occasions, someone at the table becomes nervous and asks if she should go to the phone and answer it for me, and I say no, and bravely repeat my resolve to ignore it. But the pesky thing goes ringing, and presently I hear myself saying, "Oh, do go and see what they want." I pretend to go on eating my dinner, but just the same, I hear my friend struggling with the other end, explaining about office hours and applying to the secretary in the morning. I cannot stand it any longer. Ignoring the protests of my friend, who thinks she's doing a good job on the telephone, I get on the line. Somebody I never heard of before is at the other end, and I hear his desperate statements. I have no choice. I tell him I will see him as soon as he arrives. When I go back at the table, my friends and I will see him. When I go back to the table, my friends abuse me as if I did not have enough trouble, and my dinner is spoiled. My friends in other professions seem to be able to keep office hours and the statements of their secretaries, as do the time open, is accepted as final. I often envy my doctor friends who deal with patients. It seems to me I deal mostly with impatience. I recall one of my secretaries who weepingly desired to give up her job. "Miss Adams," she sobbed, "I just can't take my life in my hands when I tell them that you cannot see them right off." I seem to be looked upon as a public official. One would-be client who failed in his effort to make an appointment by telephone arrived at the door just the same, and when assured that no time was open, protested violently. I wonder what Miss Adams thinks she is. Upon my word, she's harder to get at than the President of the United States. But my secretaries do the best they can, and with some cooperation from the prospective caller, an appointment is usually made. I see no one before luncheon except my secretary and such members of my staff as are ready to report on the research work which is always going forward in some branch of science. I do not try to keep my morning office hours. I do my work wherever I happen to be in the city, or in the country, in the studio, or in bed. At noon I violate all the advice I give other people by bolting the sketchiest kind of lunch. I accept no luncheon invitations, and I give none. I dictate between bites and swallow between letters. Such is my morning and my nooning. From luncheon to dinner I am as completely cloistered as if I were in jail. My consultations begin at an appointment hour, and they continue inexorably at 30-minute intervals until night. It is years since I have had an unscheduled appointment period. If someone fails to appear, there's always a waiting list to take the place. But of these office complications I know nothing. My secretary handles all these details without referring to me. I never consult the appointment book. I never know the identity of the person who enters the room unless, of course, he is an old client whose face I recognize. And I have no wish to cloud my mind with names and personalities. People tell me I never even look at them. I don't know about that. I don't mean to be impolite. But for the first few minutes of the interview, I certainly do not care whether my caller is blonde or brunette, short or tall, light as a canary feather or heavy as a truck. All I wish to know is where and when the person was born, facts which I immediately write in the hub of my wheel-like chart. And all I wish to do is give the facts my undivided attention, give these facts my undivided attention until the bell tells me that the half hour is up. Naturally, I've learned to make the most expert use of this brief time in order to profit my visitor as fully as possible. In case the client before me is a regular consultant, my secretary has already taken his chart from the files and placed it on my desk. If he's a new client, I must drop a horoscope then and there. I've learned to allow myself only 3 to 5 minutes of the precious half hour for making the intricate mathematical calculations necessary to determine the position of the planets in the chart. I must work fast. But my 30 years' experience is my guarantee to myself of that accuracy upon which reliable of my deductions wholly depends. The doctor's mistake is buried, the lawyer's mistake is hanged, but the astrologian must not make a mistake. Many serious-minded consultants check up every statement in their horoscope and write me long letters how each one compares with their character and experience as they themselves see. One woman listed 26 such comparisons and agreed with me in 25 of them. The only thing that was wrong, she said, was about my tendency to get anger. I haven't a trace of a temper. The oldest inhabitant never saw me mad. Then she added, but I do get obstinate when I know that I am in the right! Exclamation point. Many of the instances in which she admitted that stars were correct would, I suppose, be amazing to those who are not accustomed to astrology's infallibility. For instance, I told her that in her early life must have been tangled, and she told me that it was, that her mother didn't like her father and finally gave her to another relative to bring up. I told her that her throat was her vulnerable point, and she said I had quinsy and acute tonsillitis from my youth on, until specialists marveled that I lived. I'm one of the few cases that were not helped by having tonsils removed years ago. I foresaw strange experiences in love affairs, and she confessed that her first fiancé had turned out to be an adventurer who thought she had money, and that her husband, an admirable fellow, had died, leaving her 3 children to support. I saw by her stars that she was very nervous and had a tendency to heart trouble. She admitted that both were only too true, that she had inherited nerves from a mother who had been through frightful experiences in the Chicago fire, from which she'd never recovered, and that she herself had suffered heart trouble for years. I told her she had a gift with children, and she told me she was by profession a kindergarten teacher. And at the end of her long epistle, she added, "Oh, one other thing. There was a fire in my home just 3 days ago before I received your letter." The fact that this woman picked out one of the most critical things I said about her as the only one that was wrong illustrates an attitude that was not unprecedented in my experience. but I would like to go on record as saying that I find very little of it in my life. Most of my consultants take the bad things I say, along with the good, and cheerfully acknowledge the correctness of both. When I said a little while back, that's all I wished to know was when and where a person was born, I did not, scientifically speaking, tell the whole truth. That is all I need to know to draw up the chart, but in consideration of the chart, I also give attention to the position of the planets at the time the person enters the room or propounds his question. This branch of the science is called Horary Astrology, and it goes back to ancient times. I myself have a priceless volume on the subject by William Lilly, student in astrology, printed in England, 1647. But I have departed the procedure of the ancients and from the procedure of other modern astrologers in that use of Horary astrology, and it is quite possible that in this departure I shall have made my most lasting contribution to the science for which I've devoted my life. I've been advised against writing the rest of this chapter. Don't give away your secrets, is the burden of that advice. But my answer is that I have no secrets. The public, if it is interested in me at all, has a right to know how I work. Other astrologers, if they can learn from my experience, are welcome to the opportunity. The more good astrologers there are, the better for the science. No one, by gaining knowledge for himself, can take anything away from me. Even as a child, I realized this truth. I knew that I could never lose anything which was really mine. If anybody could rob me of a friendship, it was because a friend didn't really belong to me. This conviction saved me many a heartache in my personal life. It has protected me in my professional life against the devastating influence of a jealousy, and has made impossible the foolish policy of secretiveness. The ancients, in their horary astrology, considered the mundane positions of the heaven at the time the individual sought to answer his query. I consider also the position of the heavens in relation to the individual's own chart. The difference may seem trivial, but every competent astrologer who reads these words will know that it's fundamental, and I assert as a fact which I have established after years of research and experimentation that if I draw my conclusions from the position of the planets in combination with the chart of the individual at the moment I'm asked to decide a given question, I will get my answer, and it will be the right answer. This is my method. I note the degree that is rising the moment the client arrives. I then adjust his chart so the corresponding degree in that chart will be the accidental ascendant, and proceed to read the horoscope as if it were the radix. My first caller, after I finally convinced myself that I had at last found this most important of all keys to the astral vaults, was a woman who lived in Lexington, Massachusetts. I drew her radical chart as usual, placing the planets in their proper places in the circle. I then adjusted the chart as described above, and discovered that Saturn, the indicator of worry and misfortune, was at the moment of her question in that position of the heavens which rules brothers and sisters. So I asked her if by any chance she was worried about her brother's health. She replied, "Why? That is just what I am here for. My brother's very ill." I asked for the dates of the brother's wife, drew up her horoscope, adjusted it, and found her Saturn to be in the 7th house, governing the husband. His mother's Saturn, by the same process, fell in the 5th house, governing offspring. I remember this case with especial vividness because it came as a culmination and an immediate practical verification of my years of scientific research. Since that time, I've had thousands of other confirmations. I have them every day with every client. Just as the position of Saturn indicates the source of worry, so all the planets tell their story and show on the adjusted astrological clock the joys, successes, and possible misfortunes that may befall the questioning client in the immediate future. Whenever the ever-changing moon appears in this so-called accidental ascendant, I feel sure a journey or change is contemplated, or the opportunity for travel will soon be presented. If Mars, the planet which governs the warrior and surgeon, and also accidents and quarrels, is the first to rise, I then feel sure that an operation, an accident, or a quarrel will be the first happening to engage my caller. If I find Neptune holds the ascendancy, I feel positive that some form of intrigue or camouflage is just ahead. In some cases, instead of the deception coming from the outside world, it means the individual is self-deceived and must not take his own ideas too seriously or try to put through the scheme which he may have in mind at the moment. If the intuitive Uranus by any chance is about to rise, I tell then my client that he must not take too seriously any seemingly promised good or threatened misfortune, as it will be the unexpected that will actually happen. If Venus and the Sun or Jupiter chance to bestow their beneficent influence by being the first to rise, I know that a new love, a new honor, a new blessing is imminent, and regardless of the position of other planets in the chart, indicating either ill or good fortune, I know that my consultant's own life and happiness is assured for the moment, and that his immediate future will be rosy. Let me give an illustration of this new horary. About a year ago, an old client, a Tammany leader, entered my studio at a time when in his adjusted chart Uranus was about to rise. Without waiting for him to say anything, I warned him against going into any venture at the time that would not be practical. Because of his established confidence in the science, he shelved the contemplated project without further discussion. About a month ago, he insisted on giving me the details, and at this time, his Saturn was rising. I told him that the indications were less promising than before. Either the scheme would die, or someone essential to it would die. Again, he accepted my decision and did not invest. I've just left the telephone. He tells me that I'm right again. Last night, J.J. Frawley dropped dead at the Dixieville Notch. This gentleman, at one time state senator and prominent leader in the great organization of Tammany Hall, was the one essential to the project. He also reminded me that 2 years before, when I read Mr. Frawley's horoscope, I told him that he would die very suddenly when away from home. He told me from that time on the senator had avoided when possible leaving town. But destiny fulfills itself. There is no limit to what I can say about this new horary astrology. I could talk about it for volumes, and someday I may do so. But right now I wish to get back to the scene in my studio, where the radical horoscope being in hand, I concentrate wholly on the study of it. This means a total ignoring of the client himself. If he be inclined to talk and ask questions, he does so to deaf ears. Again, my 30 years' experience is behind me, and my guarantee to myself that I shall be able to make a scientifically correct diagnosis either of the whole life of a new client or of the special problems the old client is bringing to me. This study takes more or less time according to the complexities of the chart or the problem. Then I'm ready to read a report on my visitor's general conditions, such as his ill health, his financial prospects, and his domestic relations. Up to that time, I've neither asked nor attended questions. My attitude has been wholly and intentionally impersonal. I've been dealing scientifically with the chart. Now I enter into the personal relation with my caller and realize him as a human being, and together we discuss his horoscope from his standpoint. His problem becomes a personal concern. He's my brother indeed. Often he seems to be my child. Our contact is no longer a matter of impersonal science, but of intimate, warm human relation. I try to give him the benefit of my astrological knowledge interpreted in the light of philosophy I have acquired through my long study of human nature. The arches that support the bridge of this philosophy are true and balance, which I believe are also fundamental principles of the universe. Balance on the physical plane results from an equal distribution of weight about the point of support. On the mental plane, it results from an equalized relation between cause and effect. Viewed from the spiritual plane, the act of the here and now appears as a true projection of the eternal and infinite. The general understanding of truth is so vague that it seems almost disrespectful to limit it to definition. Indeed, truth is the ultimate, like God and other eternities, escape definition. I found, however, that the finite truth we deal with in our lives, with which works out in our practical doing and being, not only can be defined, but must be. This finite truth is simply faithfulness to pattern. The horoscope shows the balance of forces at work in my client's life. Often it shows a lack of coordination between the mental and the spiritual. And I believe it to be my task with the light of astrology to assist him so far as possible to regulate his powers and bring back to balance or harmony into his life. I strive to be governed by honesty and charity, but I do not burden my client with my considerations of general truth and balance. I deal with his situation. If he comes with shoulders bent under the burden of life, I'm usually able by studying his stars to help him distribute the weight so it may be carried without loss of equilibrium. And I must loose all my humanities and tap my every source of information in order to relate the forces disclosed in the horoscope to the requirements of the human being and his present interest. The client, in bringing me his problem, is focused upon that alone. With the horoscopes read before me, I, however, realize this is merely a link in the chain of his life and the inevitable outcome of his past and the point from which his future is to be projected. For instance, if he's threatened with complete financial breakdown, and I see that in the course of a few years, he will be fully reestablished in the financial world. But then I know that the present embarrassment is merely a test, out of which he is to gain qualities that will build him the greater success. On the other hand, even though the new venture promises immediate success, the horoscope may show me that it involves a future disaster. And so I'm able to indicate not only its immediate value, but its relation to what is to come. My emotions are not supposed to be involved, but believe me, they sometimes push me hard. The longer I work, the more I find myself consumed by a desire to comfort and uphold the person before me in the struggle to follow the patterns which his horoscope has shown to me and the difficulties of what my heart comprehends. I admit that the half-hour bell often sounds to me like the crack of doom, and it takes all my courage to bring the interview to a close, but the bell is imperative. And in an instant, I find myself facing a new client and again entering into an impersonal and scientific consideration of a chart. The chart in all cases is divided like the heavens themselves into 12 parts, a wheel-like figure with a hub in the center, where I write the day, hour, and place of birth of the person whose horoscope I'm reading. This chart looks like a clock, and I often think of the planets and signs in terms of hour hands and minute and second hands moving at varying speeds over the broad face of the universe. Some of these movements are very slow, affecting the world as a whole over periods of centuries. We're just now emerging from what many people call the age of saviors, lasting 2,000 years, during which the human race has been led forward by a succession of great saviors. We're now coming into Aquarius, or humanitarian age, where each man is his own savior. And that is why the Great War has produced no outstanding world leader, why experiments in democratic and communist governments are bobbing up on every side, why a man like Mussolini, anachronism in this comparative age, in spite of his greatest gifts, will never attain that degree of world leadership to which he quite naturally aspires. These are the slow hourly movements of the astrological clock. There, then, are the minute and second hands moving more rapidly in cycles of months and years instead of centuries, sometimes affecting the whole world, sometimes particular parts of the world, sometimes individuals like you and me. 30-odd years ago, for instance, the world came very strongly under the influence of the planet Uranus in Scorpio, which rules invention on a material plane. Children born during this period, regardless of other influences in their individual horoscopes, were sure to be interested in mechanical things like phonographs, player pianos, moving pictures, automobiles, airplanes, and radios. And they are. But for several years past, the world has been under the influence of Uranus and Aquarius, which rules invention on the spiritual plane. Children born at this time should be able to find answers to unresolved social problems, which are proving too elusive for their more material-minded parents. The competent astrologer knows in advance the general conditions affecting the world and the region to which the child be born. She knows the influences governing the period as far as all mankind is concerned. Her job is to relate the knowledge to the individual. It's a fascinating study in theory and in practice. I not only apply it many times every day to the thousands of people who come to see me in my New York studio and to other thousands who write for me from every corner of the starlit earth, but I steal time from eating and sleeping to read the horoscope of every interesting person of whom I hear. There is no more enthusiastic believer in the stars than Evangeline Adams of Carnegie Hall. Chapter 2. A Grim Success. My father died when I was 15 months old, and my mother, in accordance with his wish, brought up my 3 brothers and myself in the theological atmosphere of Andover Hill. My earliest recollection of those days in the famous New England town is of a circus, staged by youthful Adamses and witnessed by professors and students from Andover Theological Seminary, girls from Abbott Academy, boys from Phillips Academy, and a group of townspeople that included Harriet Beecher Stowe, already famous as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, who later wrote Gates Ajar. I remember the boys' despair when I refused to ride Jack, our big Newfoundland dog, as they'd planned and insisted on mounting Jockey, then the family Dobin, but once famous circus horse, and real inspiration to the whole performance. They appealed to Mother to apply the Adams hickory stick, but she allowed me to have my jockey and my way. I was very grateful and showed it by not falling off. This was my premiere as a public character, and I could not have been more appreciative or a distinguished audience. After that incident, Mother allowed me to ride Jockey every day to the little red schoolhouse nearly 8 miles away. I remember how I used to park Jockey in the woodshed during school hours as to protect him from the sun, rain, and cold. Those were happy days. But they held one dark moment for Jockey and me. I had a suitor, freckled son of the janitor of the school, who refused to take my rebuffs in good spirit. In fact, he revenged himself on me by taking my poor horse out of the woodshed and hitching him in all kinds of weather to the schoolyard fence. I stood this cruel indignity as long as I could until one day, when I looked through the grimy cobwebby window, I saw Jockey shivering and shaking in a driving windstorm. This was too much. I bolted from the schoolhouse, mounted my old friend, and rode through the wind and rain to the village 8 miles distance, where the school board happened to be in session, and I didn't continue my education that day until I was able to return triumphant with an official permit entitling Jockey Adams to a permanent occupation of the school woodshed. I'm reminded of my early affection for Jockey by my later and continuing love for Jupiter, the high-spirited companion of many a happy hour, and by Jupiter's recent contribution vicariously as it happened to astrological lore. 10 summers ago, I was under accidental conditions. The stars indicated that I should take precautions against physical mischance. So I decided not to ride Jupiter, who wasn't the safest mount under the best conditions, and substituted for him a disreputable little bronco, as lazy as she was fat. But I couldn't escape my stars. The little beast bucked and threw me into the gutter. No serious injuries resulted, as there might have been from Jupiter's greater height and speed, but I'm still stiff from this, and to me a necessary proof of astrology's infallibility. My first instructor in the science, and later my great benefactor and friend, was Dr. J. Herbert Smith, professor of Materia Medica at Boston University, and at the time the leading diagnostician of New England. Dr. Smith was not a professional astrologer and never practiced the science except in connection with his medical work, but he was a student of Sanskrit and Eastern religions, and he'd acquired an understanding of the science much deeper and more philosophical than most modern astrologers. When Dr. Smith died, he left me his manuscripts and the results of his many years of careful research, and his belief and confidence in my future. And during his lifetime, he'd given me long hours of patient, kindly instruction and advice. The events leading up to my meeting with Dr. Smith offer an excellent example of the way misfortune often results in blessing. I had been seriously ill for several months and had slowly and painfully fought my way back to health with the help of the family physician, Dr. Whiting. During those months of suffering, I did not see how any good could come out of so much evil, but it did. For it was Dr. Whiting who first sent me to Dr. Smith, not as a patient, but as a young woman in whom he had discovered some unusual ideas. If I hadn't been a very sick girl, I might have not known Dr. Whiting so well, or Dr. Smith at all. Indeed, I might never have studied astrology. Unthinkable! The first time I went to see the great diagnostician, he asked me the date and hour and place of my birth, questions which I have since asked so many thousands of times, and made out the horoscope chart showing the position of the stars when I was born. Then he amazed me by saying, "Didn't you break your leg when you were 9 years old?" "I broke my leg all right," I replied, "but I can't be sure how old I was." When I reached home, I asked my mother about the accident. She told me it happened in January, and I was 9 the following month. In the first hour I spent with Dr. Smith, he gave me so many remarkable evidences of astrology, all-seeing knowledge, But the simple accident of the broken leg would not remain in my thoughts if it weren't that accident itself gave me my first lesson in a philosophy which has dominated my life: the futility of swimming against the tide when you might as well swim with it. The morning I met my accident, my mother advised me not to take my sled. I replied I was going to take the sled if it broke my leg. Mother did not permit it. She told me years afterward that she knew I was the kind of child who had to learn by experience. So I did take my sled, I did break my leg, and I did get the experience, which has done more for me in its way than any other one event in my life. I realized that my policy of opposing stubborn-willed to wise counsel is weakness, and that my mother's policy of intelligent non-resistance is the greatest power in the world. The lesson is what a broken leg taught me at the receptive age of 9. I suppose I experienced, during this first interview with Dr. Smith, the same excitement which so many of my callers and correspondents tell me when they get out of their first realizations the power of astrology. I remember how amazed I was to see my whole life, past and present, spread out on a table between us as a matter of mathematical calculation and philosophical interpretation, and I think I realized even that the latter is quite as important as the former. Many years later, I received from one of my own clients a letter written on the stationery of the Chatham Hotel in New York, which expressed and phrased just what Dr. Smith gave to me in that first interview. Dear Miss Adams, had a physician accomplished for my body that which you have accomplished for my soul, $1,000 fee would have been in order. For in addition to soothing the temporary turbulence of my mind, you open to me for all time a new visa, for which lack of other words I must call the fourth dimension of philosophy. The fourth dimension sounds a bit foreboding, but fortunately astrology's philosophy is translated into terms of everyday life. Dr. Smith consulted the stars in their language, but he talked to me in mine. There's nothing highbrow or forbidding about astrology, but is very dependent on the astrologer. Any book on the science can tell you what aspects are favorable and unfavorable, but you must have wisdom to weigh and interpret and apply them to the individual. It is not the fault of religion that several ministers fall, and it is not the fault of astrology that not all astrologers are like Dr. Smith. The great man's first remark after he asked me the apparently trivial question about breaking my leg was to the effect that I was a born astrologer and should study the science. And before I left, he showed me how he made out his horoscope and explained the wheel-like figure which divided the chart in 12 signs of the zodiac. I had already seen what he wrote, my dates in the hub of the wheel, and after consulting various books and making intricate mathematical calculations, entered into a chart the positions of the planets in reference to those dates. The thing fascinated me. At school, I never cared for languages, but loved mathematics, ancient history, and philosophy, and I saw in this study, which embodied all my loves, well, as it turned out, my life. When you come before St. Peter, said Dr. Smith, I will tell him the fact that you have no children is not to be held against you. Your horoscope denies you offspring of your own, but it indicates you're better able to rock the cradle of the world than the cradle of one child. Dr. Smith told me many things that seemed remarkable to me then, but which now, with my experience of astrology's range and infallibility, are nothing more than routine. He said that I would not marry the man to whom I was engaged, and I didn't. He said that a much richer man would propose to me during the following year, and he did. He told me that I would never have another planetary aspect in my whole life that would be apt to bring a proposal from a millionaire, and I haven't. He told me that I had an influential planet in the house of travel which would take me to visit many foreign countries, and I have done so. My latest crossing, I sincerely hope it wasn't my last, was number 30 in the annals of my ocean travel. In fact, he told me with startling accuracy the basic facts of my life. One thing bothered him. I gave him the hour of my birth as 7 in the morning, but he insisted it could not be true, as his zodiacal sign rising at that moment indicated a person of a much slighter build and fairer complexion. But Dr. Smith, I promised, my mother said it was 7 o'clock. She ought to know, he replied, and then added with true professional bluntness, but if you'd been born at that time, you would have been very beautiful. Apparently that settled it. He proceeded to draw out my chart for 8:30, a time which coincided with my personal appearance. And years later, when I had almost forgotten this feature of my first astrological interview, I I found an old diary of my father's in the attic of my brother's house in Chicago. In this diary, he recorded the exact moment when each of the children came into the world. Mine was 8:30 in the morning. The difference of a few minutes in a person's birth may be unimportant, but it's vital to the matter of the scientifically minded astrologer. And as I write, my mind goes at once to a scene many years ago in New York Maternity Hospital. An expectant father was standing outside a half-closed door. For nearly 30 minutes, he'd been standing there with a stopwatch in his hand, waiting for the exact moment of the baby's birth. Split seconds were not too accurate for him because he was an astrologer and wished to cast the child's horoscope. The big moment came. The great doctor behind the half-closed door delivered a rosy baby girl, perfect in every particular, except the position to which she entered the world, meant almost invariably strangulation. "There goes the baby," cried the doctor, and it was a cry of professional dismay, of baffled skill, of frustrated effort. The father outside heard the doctor's unguarded explanation, and his heart almost stopped beating, but he was a true astrologer. He took from his pocket a sheet of paper which was printed a clock-like chart of the heavens and entered the center of the wheel the exact moment of the daughter's birth. In a few feverish seconds, he cast a horoscope, satisfied himself that his baby wouldn't die, couldn't die, according to the stars under which she was born, and entered the confinement room with the air of calm assurance. "That baby is not gone," he said to the astonished doctor. "She will live, and she will be a strong, well child." And she did live. Today she is nearly 5. She's well and strong and beautiful, and I know because that father astrologer had been a pupil of mine, because I too have read that child's horoscope, and because I have seen that child. Another thing which Dr. Smith told me at the first interview made an unfading impression on me. He said right away, "You're not only a born astrologer and should take up the study of the science, but you should also go a long way with it. Fear was left out of your horoscope. I doubt if you fear man, God, or devil." These words of encouragement were costly enough to Dr. Smith, for I pestered him until he finally agreed to take the time from his lectures and his practice of medicine to give me the sound astrological teaching on which my success is based. With his help, and with the help of astrological books which he loaned me, I was soon giving private readings which first amused and then amazed my circle of intimates. Dr. Smith's service to me cannot be estimated in terms of money, but the gift of his time and the loan of his books were actually of no small money value to me then. Even the cost of a book was a big thing to consider when it meant going without a new hat. I remember distinctly having to decide on one occasion between a much-needed Easter bonnet to replace one of 3 years' service and a rare old book on astrology. It is needless to add that I used the old bonnet a 4th year and purchased the book, a sacrifice of which I was reminded last week by running across this phrase in a letter from a Texas woman who had written me for her planetary indications. "I feel that I must have them right away, and into them goes the price of my winter hat." Then she adds with a philosophy which seemed like a distant echo of my own, "But what is a head covering in comparison with a soul covering?" My friend's stars proved almost interesting to me as my own. Already I had come to realize that each of us has an individual life to lead, and that we must work it out event by event, not only accordingly to the divine law which governs all nature, but in strict accordance to the pattern of the individual horoscope. As for my friends, the facts I was able to tell them about the indications in their horoscopes about the past and the insight I was able to give them in the impending future so amazed them that they began sending their friends, and in a short time the circle widened so properly, introduced strangers who refused to take up any time without offering some compensation for my interpretation. I appreciated their feelings and devoted every cent they insisted on paying me to my increasing astrological library and widening my scope of my investigations. When one far-sighted person remarked, "Well, we'll see your shingle yet," I immediately rejected the thought. I had no professional ambitions, which was perhaps fortunate, because the practice of astrology at the time was not highly regarded, especially among the Boston friends of the Adams family. I didn't pull out a single shingle. I didn't have to. But in time I took a studio in the Hotel Copley in Boston, where I remained in practice until I came to New York in 1899. Before leaving Boston, I consulted my stars and found that the beginning, about the middle of March of that year, in 1899, I was coming under some of the most propitious planetary conditions of my life, and that the good auspices applied especially to the astrological work in which I now have been for some years engaged. No one can say that I do not follow the dictates of astrology in my own life, and no one who looks back on the dramatic events of those first hours on Fifth Avenue will question the wisdom of so doing. Yet at the same time, everything seemed to go wrong. Mr. Vanal, the proprietor of the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City, had known my family ever since he started his hotel business. He received me with enthusiasm and was about to establish me in one of his most delightful rooms overlooking Madison Square. When I mentioned my interest in astrology and my intention of reading horoscopes in the hotel, the old man was horrified. Miss Adams, he said, I shall always be glad to receive you as a guest, but I can't stand for your astrology. I suppose I might have been able to overcome his objections. Adamses had been coming down from Boston and putting up on Fifth Avenue, well, ever since they stopped registering at the Astor Hotel in Lower Broadway, Astor House in Lower Broadway. And from the time I broke my leg at the age of 9, I'd been of the opinion that the non-resistance was my line. So I did not try to force myself on Mr. Vanel. I tell this incident without rancor. It merely indicates the disrepute in which the oldest of the sciences was then held and emphasizes the change in public opinion in something less than 30 years. Today, the practice of astrology by competent astrologers is a respected, honorable profession. The law recognizes and protects it in many parts of the country as it does in the practice of medicine. Prominent men and women come openly to my studios in Carnegie Hall. They consult the stars as naturally and as confidently as they would consult a reference book in a public library. Even Mr. Vanal, in the years before the Fifth Avenue Hotel was raised, invited me to come to his hotel any time and practice my science. The world moves, but the stars are fixed. Although in perspective I smile over this first encounter with provincial prejudice in supposedly broad-minded New York, I didn't do much smiling when I found myself suddenly homeless on the sidewalk of Madison Square. The dignity of my beloved science had been insulted. I've been insulted. I was what my ancestors would have described as righteously indignant. In short, I was mad, clear through, and I must have made a neat picture of youthful determination as I staggered along the weight of my carefully overpacked portmanteau. Of course, I didn't know that I was committing a social error by carrying my own bag in so fashionable a neighborhood, but I should have experienced a certain wicked pleasure if I had known it. I was in a mood to defy assistance in the world, so I put off up the avenue with my dignity in one hand and my luggage in another, and the proverbial New England umbrella slapped under one arm. By the time I reached the Windsor Hotel, in that day in the New York home of many visiting notables, my feelings had calmed. Perhaps, too, my arms had tired. In any case, I entered respectfully the portals of the great building, which was destined to bring me sudden fame, the nature and extent of which I did not at the time suspect. I found the proprietor, Mr. Leland, a most charming host, sympathetic with my work and aims. He took me personally to a suite on the first floor and another on the fifth floor, later known as the Fateful Fifth. The first suite cost $12 a day, a large sum for those times, and a larger one for my pocketbook, but sometimes doubtless the favorable auspices under which I was working made me choose it in preference to the much cheaper fifth floor rooms. This was about 8 o'clock in the evening, Thursday, March 16, 1899. Tomorrow, said Mr. Leland in his jovial way, will be Friday, a bad luck day. You better give me a reading now. I laughed. Because of my knowledge of the stars, I know this will seem to some people a funny thing to say, but it protects me from such superstitions. But Mr. Leland insisted. I want to be your mascot, he said. So I took out one of my charts, entered the date and hour of his birth, and began to calculate the position of his stars. Suddenly I saw something which made me hesitate. The man was under one of the most worst possible combinations of planets conditions, terrifying in their unfriendliness. I remember telling him that the danger was so imminent that this might overtake him tomorrow, and his reply, "Oh, tomorrow's a holiday. Stocks can't go down." He was a great speculator, and even when he learned that the unfavorable conditions affected not only him, but his entire family, his mind still reverted to the stock market. He said he would be most careful in all his pending operations, and I noticed he'd been under similar conditions twice before in his life, though not nearly so malefic, and I asked him if misfortune had not pursued him in those times. The most he could remember were two fires, small ones, which had broken out in the hotel. He was inclined to dismiss all thought of any present danger until the market opened on Saturday morning. However, he was also amazed by the general accuracy of the reading that he sent guests to me that evening until long after midnight the next morning. He again showed his interest by coming in to see if everything was comfortable and to ask me to write out his astrological indications for the following week. My mind was filled with a horror which was hanging over this kindly, hospitable man, that I forced myself to consult his chart again. There could be no doubt of the accuracy of my first reading. The danger which confronted him was so clearly indicated and so imminent that it seemed as if the man in front of me was being pushed at the very moment into the depths of disaster. I tried to be calm and professional in my warnings, but I could not control the chills which ran through my body, and obviously I was not able to conceal them, for this, on his way out, Mr. Leland pressed a button at the left of the door 4 times. "You're chilly in here," he said. "I'll have the porter make a fire in your fireplace." He opened the door and walked into the greatest hotel disaster of all times, the famous Windsor fire. The fateful 5th floor was already gone. The floors immediately above me were in flames. My own floor was the only one intact. I gathered up the most important of my papers and walked out of that hotel. I suffered no inconvenience except the natural feeling of agitation. But as I stood on the steps of what was then Helen Gould's house and watched the crumbling of Mr. Leland's most cherished worldly possession, I thought of my prophecy. I saw the greater Fifth Avenue facade plunge stupendously across the famous thoroughfare. I saw figures so blackened by smoke and soot, I thought they were colored servants drop from the upper windows to the asphalt at my feet. I saw a woman beautifully attired in a tea gown with a long train, hugging to her bosom a small kitten she saved from the fire, and walking unconscious across the stretched out bodies of the victims. But I did not know until the next morning, when I picked up the newspaper, the extent of the disaster which had overtaken my new friend, the disaster that was written in the stars. Poor man! Not only had he lost his hotel, which was his joyful pride, and seen scores of his friends and guests jump from windows to their death, but he had lost several members of his family, and among them his favorite daughter, Helen. A grim success, you may call it. My first astrological reading in New York, and such it was. I would have given anything I possessed at the time that this prediction had not come so terribly true, but the stars decreed otherwise, and they had decreed that so far as I was concerned, good should come out of evil. For next in importance to the news of the fire itself was Mr. Leland's statement, printed in big type across the front page, that the disaster had been predicted by Evangeline Adams of Boston. This concludes the first 2 chapters of the story A Bowl of Heaven by Evangeline Adams, narrated by Lori Carvelli of 3 Keys Astrology. Stay tuned for the next couple of chapters as we proceed this book of a most famous astrologer who moved to New York in 1899, New York City, and practiced until her death in 1926 in Carnegie Hall, New York City.